Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to another late night stream. I'm trying to do these streams a little bit earlier each day. Unfortunately, had some family medical stuff going on today. So everybody lift a prayer for my stepdad, Greg. He's in the hospital right now getting some blood clots checked out. Been a really crazy, stressful night for the family, so any prayers for him would be greatly appreciated. But welcome, everybody, whoever ends up joining. Like I said, sorry it's a little bit of a late night, just been a crazy day. Welcome to a late night stream with Didact. Got some good updates to share with all of you. I think you're going to enjoy seeing the little bits and pieces that I talk about. And I'm really excited to say that I think I might have solved the last major architectural dilemma that I've been facing. And I'm really happy to talk to you about that a little bit tonight. So just a little bit of background. I love this groovy lo-fi music I'm listening to. Hope that doesn't bother you guys. Helps me kind of sink into the workspace so I can focus. So if you've been watching the last few streams, you'll know that I've been talking about basically the deployment model and the library model inside of Didact. I've been trying to figure out how exactly I want to model that from an entity perspective in the data model and in the database. That's been a really unpleasant, I'll say, issue to figure out. It's been really dicey. So I was sort of reevaluating what kind of entities I want to use with Didact's data modeling. And I was also thinking about the CLI because, of the other things that I want besides a sensible data model, the other thing that I want is a set of CLI commands that just make sense for you, that make the DX really enjoyable and as simple as possible. At the same time, I also want the platform to be robust. And I know that every founder can get tripped up with overcomplicating their product in the initial days. That's the death of a lot of startups. But the great news is this is my product, and I'll build it how I want to. And I really think it's going to pay off. You guys are really going to like this a lot. So, as I've been sort of going through the deployment model and the sort of refactoring the different entities and so on that I have, I think I've landed on something that is both sensible and minimal, yet it offers the opportunity for flexibility and customization that I think you're really going to like. So I can kind of walk you through what some of those entity changes are. And, you can let me know what you think about the changes. But I think they're a net positive, to be honest. I sort of reevaluated some long-standing architectural decisions I had made a very long time ago, as well as some CLI commands and some of the entities. And I kind of came to the conclusion maybe 2 days ago. I was sort of I don't know. That might be a bit overcomplicated. Not even for version 1, but really for any version of Didact, I might be trying to account for some stuff that's just too ridiculous. So, why don't we take a look in Visual Studio, and I'll show you some of the changes that I made. And we'll just do a little bit of work tonight, even if it's just simple stuff. I know, it's really late on my end. Even if it's just something simple working on the dock side or whatever, I'm good with that. Every little bit, every little day counts. And figuring out this last bunch of gunk, for lack of a better term, this has been the real main holdup for getting Didact across the finish line. And I think it's going to be really good. Now that I've sort of figured out this last piece, I think I have, for the most part. So yeah, let's take a look at Visual Studio. Kind of show you what some of those updates are. All right. Make sure my screen's showing. Perfect. Okay. Yeah, so kind of changed a few things. I had a library table and basically a library deployment table, or an entity, I should say. I had a library entity and a library deployment entity and some associated deployment entity like related types, as well as a library version. All of these were different entities in the entities folder, and I think this is the Didact Services project. Yeah, those were all entities that were here in the entities folder, and you know, I've actually kind of deleted them, and I kind of decided to go with something a little different that I think actually kind of makes more sense, to be honest. So maybe I'll start with the config file for, or not the config file, maybe I'll start with the deployments file. How about that? For a given, you know, flow library. Why don't we start with the deployment file, and I'll kind of talk through that, and then we can come back to the entities and talk about that a little bit. So let me see if I've got an example deployment file. I've got an old one, but that one's a little bit old. One second. Let me see if I can grab a more, let me see if I can grab a more up-to-date one. One moment. Hold on. I think this one's pretty close to what I want. Well, actually, I take that back. Well, yeah, okay. I think this one's a little bit closer. Okay. So, take a look at this in VS Code. This is what I'm envisioning as an example deployment.json file for associating with your flow libraries. It's a JSON file. A lot of people these days are kind of going with YAML, which, you know, I guess I'm not like ultra opposed to. YAML is like pretty solid, I guess, for the most part. I don't know. I'm not like a huge fan of YAML though, because it doesn't have brackets or braces. So, I mean, you can follow the indentations, and there's probably like, you know, VS Code extensions you can install or whatever to trace them like you can in Python. But I'm just sort of used to JSON. And, you know, when you build .NET apps, everyone is used to using app settings.json files. So I sort of figured, like, why don't I just stick with, like, you know, what the common practice is for C# developers, just to keep ourselves in familiar territory. Whenever you build C# apps, everybody is already used to using app settings.json files. That's like 99% of the time, I feel like, what C# developers use. And, you know, the parsing and the serialization and deserialization, all that's really nicely built in to .NET. Like, if you still use the older library, you know, JSON.NET, that works wonderfully. Nowadays, I think most people use the system.text.json. I don't want to say NuGet. I guess it's a NuGet package, but it's like it's baked into pretty much any standard .NET app that you spin up now. And it's a really nice serialization and deserialization library for JSON. So it just makes the most sense to just kind of go with that, to be completely honest with you. So this is the JSON file. Let me just sort of talk you through how exactly it works, and moreover, why I think this is a good approach going forward. I had a rougher version of this on the previous stream that looked fairly similar to what you're looking at now, but I cleaned it up a little bit and sort of thought through, you know, like a little bit more architecture, and I think this makes sense, honestly, for the most part. So there is one change to make. This is not actually environment ID, this is environment name. This would be a string field. I'll explain this here in just a second. Let me come down here, change that to name, and that'll be production. Okay. So yeah, if you'll notice on like line 20 and line 12, how about, let's start from the top. So this is a JSON file that can be read by Didact CLI. I've never done a schema versioning, like a version tracking in a JSON file before, but I think it makes sense for the most part. I should be able to generate this pretty quickly. That'll be like a nice little versioning helper inside of the JSON file. I use a front-end library sometimes called shadcn Vue for Vue.js, and it's got a really nice CLI that's built in that you can download. I think it's an npm package, and they actually have a whole custom CLI for shadcn Vue, so you can save all of your like UI components offline. You don't just have to use them as npm libraries, which is really nice and super powerful for customization. It's like one of the coolest front-end libraries I've ever seen. Really opened my eyes to the power of what you can do with like a really functional DX-friendly CLI, and like of course the developers love it. Like it's hugely popular with developer tools and developer communities, and it's like, yeah, duh, because the DX is amazing. So anyway, check this out. This is kind of cool. On line 3, you'll notice that I have a type, and on line 4, I have an entry point. So what's up with that? I don't remember if that was on the last, rough draft version, but let me kind of walk you through what this means here. So previously, I actually have had a few people ask me in the past if instead of doing class libraries, they could do like entire apps where they make like say like a whole .NET console app, for example, and the whole thing is dedicated just to one flow. So if you had like 10 background jobs, instead of making 10 flows in one library or 10 libraries or something like that, you would make 10 different .NET apps, and every single one of them would basically be responsible for one flow. It's like a one flow per app kind of model. I have told the early adopters, frankly, I'm not super interested in going in that direction, because really the flow libraries are like the backbone of how I'm designing Didact. Everything is really built from a flow library perspective, because that just makes the most sense to me, based off of what kind of model I'm chasing here. But I thought about it. I did think about it. And I was like, well, I mean, enough people have asked about it that even though that's not really the direction I'm wanting to take the product right now, I'm not really wanting to go in that direction. But I did sort of think to myself, like, it would be nice to have the flexibility built in so I could go that direction if I wanted to. And so I decided, you know what, why don't I try and make this deployments file a little bit more on the generic side? Again, I'm not trying to like overcompensate for too much like premature optimization, but I wanted to make it flexible since a few early adopters have like mentioned it to me. That's sort of, I don't want to say alarms, doesn't set off alarms, but it, as a startup founder, it's something you want to put in the back of your mind, that people have mentioned it a few times. So anyway, I thought, it would be cool to be able to refashion this flow library into different functions. If I want to use it for flow libraries, I can. But if I want to use this JSON file for like entire apps going off that, that other model I just mentioned, that would be really nice. And I think this actually makes a lot of sense. So all of your deployment JSON files, like this example here on my screen, all of the types are going to say library for now, unless I decide to go that like one flow per app direction, at some point in the future. For now, all the types are just going to be library. And then the entry point for a flow library is the main DLL file name. And for now, I'm going to go ahead and include the file extension because I think that makes the most sense. Although maybe I'll add some friendly logic so that like if the file extension doesn't get included, it'll be okay. But I think this actually does make a lot of sense. So the entry point is basically going to tell Didact Engine like, how do I load this thing that I'm wanting to load, this deployment? How do I grab this thing and like how do I get into it to start it up? That's essentially what the entry point is. That makes sense? And then that's pretty straightforward. I'm trying to keep the fields as minimal as possible for the first few versions. So once you do that, then you've got your actual deployments. And that's an array, because I thought long and hard about this, and I think it's totally possible that you might want multiple deployments for one flow library. I know that might sound kind of crazy, but like, hear me out for a second, okay? Let's say that you've got two different servers. You've got a staging server and a production server, right? And so in the Didact data model, there is an environments table that's basically like a tenant identifier. You could think of it as like a tenant identifier in other apps. There's an environment table that has an FK field on it, basically every other table in the database. Think of it as kind of like a tenant identifier. So think of my situation I'm describing as you having a staging tenant and you having a production tenant, right? So what if it's the case that you want to test the same set of flows and the same flow library in two different tenants, or as Didact's terminology is, two different environments? You know, what if you want to do that? It's the same library, it's the same code, it's the same flows. It's just that you want to deploy them to two different sources, or you want to consume them, I should say, in two different tenants. So how do you do that, right? Like, what's the best way to do that? So I kind of thought about this, and I thought, you know, I could see where someone would want to create a flow library and push it to both staging and production, but not like have to like, you know, remake the whole library or something like that. That would be painful and very unpleasant. It would be a much better idea to have one flow library where you make this deployments, you know, JSON file, and then just have multiple deployments associated with one library. If you even want to do that, you may not even like want this, but I know for myself and for a lot of other dev teams, it's a real typical DevOps pattern to have a, you know, like a local developer environment, a shared staging environment, and then you've got your live production environment. So I kind of thought like it would be nice if you could create multiple deployments from the same flow library and, you know, point them at different environments and have different deployments. That would be, I think, pretty convenient for you. So you could do like, say, staging and production testing, right? So in this deployments file, I thought, you know, instead of having like a deployments object, I think it makes more sense to have an array in case you've got multiple deployments. I think that does make a pretty good amount of sense. So check out the deployment object. So you can look at like, say, line 13 through, or line 6 through line 13. Let's take a look at one of the deployment objects, right? So it's pretty straightforward. I try to keep as minimal an amount of information in here as absolutely possible so that, you know, it just keeps everything nice and simple. But, you know, check this out. So when you create a deployment, essentially, I'm just going to get a couple pieces of information for you. First of all, we need to know what environment the deployment is going to. And originally, I was going to do the environment ID to have like an exact reference in the database. But, you know, right now, the most divisible like tenant identifying unit in Didact's data model is the environment table. So like, I'm going to go ahead and enforce, you know, like a unique you know, name constraint on the environment entity. I'm going to set it so where like you can't have two environments, say, that are both named production, for example. Or you can't have two environments that are both named staging, and so on and so forth. I think it really does make the most sense to have unique environment names in Didact's data model, because again, like each environment is basically a tenant. So why would you have two productions, two stagings, and so on that have, you know, the literal identical name? You're probably not going to want to do that. So instead of using the ID, I thought it would be a little bit more, you know, how shall I say, developer friendly, I guess, to use a name instead, just because I'm going to add a uniqueness constraint in the database anyway, you know, just to make it nice and easy. So I think for now, I'm going to have the environment name be the first field in the deployment object. And then the other fields are pretty straightforward. So you've got an ID, a name, a description. For the ID and the name, I sort of thought, like, is it weird, to have an ID number in the config file? Is that, like, kind of stupid, or kind of weird? Because that's like, that would be like a database, value. But, I mean, to be fair, so is, like, environment name. Like, say, staging or production. Those come from the database, too. I mean, it's a config file, right? Like, it's supposed to be linked to deployments. It kind of has to be like that. So, I kind of thought about it, and I kind of just thought to myself, like, I don't know, we'll leave the ID in there for now. I think that does make sense. I could enforce a unique, like, name requirement, like a name constraint for all of the flow deployments. I could force a unique name constraint. I could do that. I could. For the moment, I'm going to say not going to worry about that just yet. We'll just stick to having the primary key, be the unique identifier for the moment. And maybe we'll introduce a unique name later, if that makes a little bit more sense. We'll see. And then you have an optional description. I'm going to make that like a nullable string field, so you don't have to have that in your deployment object, but, it doesn't hurt if you want to give it a description. Okay, and then the last two bits are what you would see, for example, on line 10 and 11. So, a deployment is not just the type of deployment and the entry point, which the type would be, library for class library, and, and the entry point would be the main library's DLL. But it's not just that, okay? It's not just the type and the entry point. With the deployment, like, Didact Engine needs to know how to get this thing. Like, where is it and how do I get it? That's kind of an important thing, right? With Didact, like, how do I find this deployment? How do I get my hands on it? So, for the moment, I have a source type field where that's basically going to be a string in enum. And so in my example, I've got file system, because I'm just going to start with one simple, straightforward source type, I guess, for the moment. And then I think we'll move to more advanced source types later. Like, maybe like a network folder that requires like a username and password or something like that. We're not going to worry about that right now. And then the GitHub repos, the Azure DevOps repos, the GitLab repos. I want to support all that stuff too, just not in the first version. That's gonna come later. That doesn't have to be here in the first version. So, you basically define a source type, which is only going to be file system for now. And then there's a file system field, which is an object. And for the moment, I've only got one field in the object, which is path. And I may rename that like folder path, folder path, I don't know, something like that. That will be essentially the path that Didact Engine has to take to find your flow library in the first place. So, that's pretty much a deployment. All the deployments share the same type because this is a flow library no matter where you send it. That makes sense. And it's the same DLL file no matter where you send it. So I think that makes sense too. So that's why the type and the entry point are not in the deployments array. That should be one shared value, like no matter how many deployments that you have. So it just made sense to pull them out. So that's pretty much it right now. Pretty simple, I hope. Pretty straightforward, I hope. And basically, this is a deployments.json file that you would keep in the version control system with your Flow library. So, GitHub or Azure DevOps or wherever it is, you've got hopefully you have source control set up for your class library. And, wherever that source control is, essentially you save this deployment.json file with it. Have it tracked in your version control. The reason that's kind of convenient is because if you jump from one developer machine to another, like let's say you're working on a laptop and then you want to work on your desktop later, right? Well, if you don't take this deployment JSON file with you, then you're not going to have your deployment information, which is a real problem. So instead, it's a much better idea to have the deployment.json file and then version control it with the rest of your Flow library. Does that make sense? I think that makes sense. So basically, wherever your library goes, this file will follow it. And then, when you want to run different commands against deployments, you just use the Didact CLI and target it at this JSON file. And I think the rest should pretty much make sense for the most part. I think the rest should work itself out, pretty well, hopefully. So yeah, this is kind of my idea with deployments in Didact. Thoughts, pros, cons, good, bad? Let me know in chat or message me on socials or whatever if you think that's good or bad, or if you have any suggestions to make. I think this makes a pretty good amount of sense right now. I'm kind of digging this model. I think it's pretty straightforward. I think it's pretty simple. Trying to keep the fields, as minimal as possible because I don't want to overkill anything on version 1. And, again, going back to my example here, you'll see that I've got 2 deployments. One is named staging and one's named production. That's kind of convenient for you. That way you can take the same Flow library and push it to 2 different, environments, 2 different targets, without having to copy like a bunch of code over and over again and all that garbage that I don't want to make you do and you definitely don't want to do yourself, because that would not be pleasant. So yeah, that's kind of the idea behind it. Multi-tenancy is sort of a feature that is not an afterthought, but is something I'm trying to bake into Didact basically from day one. I'm a SQL guy at heart, and I actually started my career doing backend stuff with SQL and databases, so I just think about this stuff like all the time. I love databases. They're ultra powerful, and you can do all sorts of analysis with them that's extremely powerful for your business if you know what you're doing and if you set up the entities and the tables correctly. And with an orchestrator like Didact, it's a massive application that should be able to process a massive number of background jobs or flows. And so there's going to be a massive amount of metadata that ideally it should capture for you. And, with all that being said, right, like I want it to be the case that I just want this thing to make sense and feel good and just to have good DX, like I was saying earlier. That's more or less what I'm getting at. So yeah, just to kind of give you an update on the entities then. So now I've got a deployment entity. And you'll notice I've got... am I missing the entry point in here? I think I'm missing the entry point in here. I'll have to add that. But you'll notice I've got a deployment type and a source type, and then the rest is just, environment, name, description. It's all pretty basic database fields. So, deployment type would be a class library or application if I decide to go that route in the future. And for now, we're not going to worry about it. We're just going to go with library for now. So that'll be the one deployment type that gets used everywhere. And then your source type, this would be the different sources that you have. So it could be file system, maybe it's network folder with credentials, GitHub repo, GitLab repo, Azure DevOps repo, stuff like that. For now, we're only going to have one source type, which is the file system. And then if you'll notice, I'm kind of going with a bit of a different database approach, but I've got a deployment source file system entity. It's pretty straightforward for the most part. There's basically only one field in here, which is folder path. And yeah, I think I'm probably gonna name that. I don't know. I think I'm gonna name it folder path in the deployment JSON file too, just because that's what I've got the entity called, here in the Didact services project. So yeah, that's pretty much the deployment. That's the new set of deployment entities that sort of correspond to this new deployment JSON, example file. I think this makes sense. This feels pretty good. I think I get this. Feels pretty straightforward for the most part. Should be flexible. Hopefully, will be simple. Yeah. Hopefully, everything works pretty good. So I was trying to think like, how exactly, how exactly, does this look from like a workflow perspective? Like when you're in your class library and you're ready to deploy it, like what are the CLI commands that you use? So I was kind of thinking through that the last couple days, and that's where I'm at right now. So here's sort of what my thoughts are on that. So like you've got your flow library open, you've been working on it, right? You've got your 1 flow, 2 flows, 10 flows, however many there are. Okay, that makes sense. So you're done, making your class library, right? So now it's time to deploy this thing and have Didact Engine pick it up and start running the flows. So what do you do? So what I'm thinking you'll do here is you'll do something like a Didact deployment init command, and that'll create a deployment file if there isn't one that's already been created for you. So you would do the type and the entry point, and then you would actually create one of these deployment objects. So that is going to be a couple different CLI commands, I think. The Didact deployment init will create the file if the file does not exist as of yet. And then I think what I'm going to do is maybe since you sort of like, if you have multiple deployments in a file, it could be the case, like let's say you make the staging deployment first, you may want to make the production deployment second. I think I need 2 different commands for creating deployments, so maybe we could do like a deployment config init file, or what would the Didact command be? For making the file, we could probably do like Didact deployment config init command and do a -- entry point, and that would set up the schema where you'd have the schema, the type, the entry point, and then an empty deployments array. I think that would probably make a pretty good amount of sense. Didact deployment config init. I think that makes pretty good sense. And then to create a deployment, you'd probably do Didact deployment create or Didact deployment init. Probably one of those two. Yeah, maybe I would just do Didact deployment init, and that would be creating the file with the type and the entry point and the empty deployments array. And then Didact deployment create would actually make a deployment. And so you would do -- name -- source type dash dash environment name. That one will probably just pull from the config itself, to be honest with you. And actually, let me double check. For the init, for the config file for the config file for Didact CLI, do we cache the environment name in that config file or no? I'm not 100% sure. Let me go back and remind myself. Core concepts, Didact CLI, config. Let's go down. Environment name. Okay. Okay. Yeah. No, we do have the name of the environment. The name of the default environment that you want to use. Okay. Yeah. So that can be set in the Didact CLI config.json file. Okay. That makes sense. So, well, actually, here, yeah, let's do that. Let's open the doc site while we're talking about API commands, so we can kind of get this down here. So I've actually got a deployment init file here, but it's an old one, so I think we're gonna change a few things. Okay. Yeah. Here's the tricky part. What I'm trying to think through is what's the CLI command for making one of these deployment objects? You've got deployment init that makes the file. You've got deployment create, which will make one of these objects. The ID will be auto-generated by the database, but then you'll have name and description, which you'll input as, arguments if you want. Staging, or not staging, environment name, that can come from the CLI's, default config, so easy peasy there. That'll be easy. It's the source type, enum. You can do you can pass in a source type, and I can list the enums on the documentation side. I think that's pretty straightforward. However, I'm just trying to think, how do I do that as a CLI command? How exactly do I do that? File system itself is, its own field according to the little schema that I've got here. But it's an object that has its own subfields. So the question is what does this look like when you input it into a CLI, as a set of commands? And I'm not 100% sure. How about this? Let's do one step at a time. Let's go to the vpress config and let's update a couple of the what's the word I'm looking for here? Nav menu options. So we'll have Didact, or we'll have deployment init. Okay. And then we're gonna have deployment create. And this is kind of what we're talking about now, is the create command. So it'll be Didact CLI deployment create. Okay, so that'll be actually creating a deployment. Pretty straightforward. If the init command creates the config file or the JSON file, we're just gonna delete that command. I don't think we really need that anymore. And then you'll notice I've got a push. So I'm trying to think through the workflow of you create a deployment in the Didact database, and then you have to somehow. So one issue that I'm sort of trying to think through right now is let's say that you're deploying your flow library to a a file system folder where Didact Engine's running. Pretty straightforward stuff, right? So you go through the Didact CLI commands and you create your deployment inside the database. Well, we got to be careful. We don't want Didact Engine to grab your deployment before it's it's actually ready to be grabbed. We don't want it to grab your deployment too quickly. Does that make sense? We don't want it to grab your deployment file too quickly. And I guess I should explain for a second, how does the deployment caching system work inside of Didact Engine? This is something where I'm going to make a default decision for the moment, and we will revisit it if necessary, and only if people ask me to revisit it, if that makes sense. But I think that... sorry, I'm blanking out here. Right, the caching system. So, inside of Didact Engine, you have to think about this from a C# perspective. A lot of the other job orchestrators that exist out there, they're all Pythonic. They're all based on Python, applications. But this is different. This is a C# application. It's not a Python application, so it's a lot different, right? So, flows themselves are just C# classes, and flows by themselves can't be loaded into Didact Engine because that's not how C# works. The way that C# works is you create a class library, you build a class library, and then you load it at runtime as a plugin. Otherwise you have to do it the normal way where you add it as a, npm package and all that kind of stuff. But we're not doing that because the whole point is that Didact Engine is supposed to be plug and play. I don't want you to have to open up the source code and modify everything and blah, 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 blah. I don't want you to have to do that, okay? So, because flows live inside of class libraries, Didact Engine can't just load one individual flow. It has to load an entire class library. So, is that costly, or does it not really matter? Well, it can be costly, I think. Because usually when you make a class library, I want to say you at least have a couple DLL files that get spit out. I think that's pretty common. And because I have a few steps on the documentation site that require you to configure your CS proj of your class library in such a way, that it makes it friendly for, runtime plugin functionality, I guess. It's, in my opinion, likely that it could be a bit costly from a memory cache perspective. And what I'm basically telling you is I don't want Didact Engine to have to grab extra copies of your flow library. That is just going to wastefully eat up space inside of Didact Engine's cache, memory cache. And or not cache, I should say, but just, the available memory that it has. And I don't really want that to happen. I'd rather have it save as many resources as possible, for running the actual flows. So, I sort of thought how should Didact Engine, how should it grab, a flow library, or in this case, a deployment, how should it grab a deployment? And again, with Pythonic job orchestrators, the way that they can do it is they can say, well, your Python script is basically just one file, which is super lightweight and super easy, So we're not gonna worry if we, call the same file 100 times or something. It's just one small file, ideally. But again, that's not the case. With class libraries, they're a little bit more on the heavy side, I would say. So, I don't really want Didact Engine to grab your... Sorry. Like I said, it's a late night stream. I don't want Didact Engine to grab, your deployments any more than absolutely necessary. I don't want to like overcomplicate this or, make the engine grab your deployment files more than necessary. Excuse me. So I was sort of thinking like through like, how do I, excuse me. How do I, how do I do this? What's the path forward for dealing with Didact Engine's whole, synchronization process for flow libraries? I've kind of come to the conclusion personally that I think I don't want Didact Engine to like synchronize your deployment except when absolutely necessary. So instead of like needlessly wasting energy over and over and over and over again, resyncing the same, flow library 100 times, which is super costly and just completely unnecessary. Instead of doing something ridiculous like that, let's just grab flow libraries only when we absolutely need to, right? Only when we need to grab them. So, I thought about maybe I thought about maybe honestly maybe following Git. I know that may sound a little bit weird, but I kind of like the workflow, honestly, of how Git does things. I kind of like that. It makes a lot of sense to me, I think, actually, sort of how Git does its workflow, where, in version control, here, perfect example in VS Code. If you change a file in your your source code repo, there's 2 steps to get it up in your cloud repository, say in GitHub. You stage it and then you push it, right? That's how Git works. So like, for example, we changed something on the vpress config file here. I would stage that to Git, and then I would do a commit and a push, and I would send it up to, the GitHub repo. So it's a 2-step process. You stage, I guess technically 3. You stage it locally, you commit it locally, and then you push it up to the server. But okay, it's like similar to it. Think of it as instead of 3 steps, it's more like 2. What if I kind of took the idea from Git here? What if I kind of decided, you know what? Why don't I do this? How about you create a deployment, do a deployment init to create a deployments JSON file. You do deployment create to like actually create a deployment, set all your stuff. And then that makes a record in the database, right? And let's say deployments have a status assigned to them, okay? And the status is either staging or pushed, or not even that. Maybe it'd be like pending and ready or something like that. Pending or active, pending or ready, something along those lines, I think makes a pretty good amount of sense. Something like a deployment status, and that would exist somewhere in the database. And so, like, if I don't want Didact Engine to needlessly deploy your same flow library, 100 times in an hour, which would be an utter waste of space, instead, why don't I have Didact Engine, like, let's say it has a little internal cron job, like a little interval that's running, like a loop, somewhere, and it checks the Didact database deployments table. And let's say every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes, or it could be every 1 minute, however often you want to do it. Maybe it checks the deployment, table, and it sees what deployments it doesn't have loaded. And whatever deployments it does not have loaded, okay, whatever deployments it does not have loaded, it finds all those deployments, syncs the data, and goes and grabs all of them. But here's the catch, right? You don't want it to grab a deployment that's not ready yet. So going back to my deployment create command here, right? Let's say that you create a deployment and you want to tell Didact, I want you to grab these files from this folder location, and that's how you can run, this flow library. Well, if you create the deployment in this JSON file before you build the class library and you put it in the, folder location, if Didact Engine tries to grab it before you actually put the files there, but you made, the deployment entity already, then you kind of got an issue on your hands, okay? Where it's going to be trying to grab a flow library that doesn't exist yet. Because, let's say you're still copying, the files over. So you want the deployment to be in the database, but what if you sort of do like a status? And it's kind of like Git. You do a stage and a push, sort of like you do with a GitHub repo or any Git repo. In the database, that could correspond to a deployment status, let's say, and one of the statuses could say staged, and the other status could say, ready or active or something like that. I don't know. I'm just kind of throwing something out there. You see where I'm kind of going. You see where I'm sort of going with that, though. Sort of have like a status field associated with the deployment entity, and that way you could create a deployment and you could push the entity, information. You could push the deployment object, up to the database and have an entity made. It's just that it's not ready yet because you've still got to let's say you've got to copy, the files into the target folder, on your file system. Now once you do that, once you do copy the files over to the, target system, okay, then you will need to tell Didact okay, hey Didact, hey, I have my deployments ready. I've created the deployment entity in the database, and now I've actually moved the files that you need into the target folder, and now it's ready. So the next time you run your little cron job and you're looking for all the deployments that you don't have and you want to start syncing them, I'm going to flip the status to ready or something like that. And now you'll know that when you cycle through, the deployments table looking for stuff that you don't have, this time you can actually grab it because the status says ready or something like that. And and then you've got something that's good to go. You've got an active, ready, available deployment. I think that makes a pretty good amount of sense for the most part. I think that makes sense. The other thing that I sort of thought about was do I want a push ID or a commit ID or something like that, associated with every deployment push? If I'm going to go with the Git CLI, workflow, if you will, where I'm kind of copying the Git CLI, do I want an individual push ID, associated with every deployment push? And that would sort of be like a version, I guess, or a commit ID or something like what you would say in Git. And am I even going to track that in the database or no? I kind of thought about that. And I kind of thought about it. I think it's a necessary requirement, honestly, because I'm just like, let's talk through the workflow for a minute, okay? Let's say you have a flow library with one flow inside of it, and you published that an hour ago, and you made a deployment, and you put it in the target folder, and you released the deployment, and everything's good to go. And Didact Engine has loaded your flow library, and it's happily running your flows right now, right? Makes pretty good sense. Okay. So now you open the same flow library again, and you want to add a second flow to it that did not exist during your first push. So let's say you add the second flow to your flow library, and you're going to put it in the same file system folder that you did previously. So your deployment information is not changing. It's the same deployment ID, it's the same deployment name and description, and it's the same, source that you're sending the build files to. The only thing that's different is like you've just got a newer version of your library that you just need to, you got to push it to the source somehow, right? Well, let's say that you throw, your deployment into the source, right? And you stage it and you push it. Okay, so now in the target folder, the source folder where your build files are, that's like a newer version of your flow library. Well, how is Didact Engine going to know that it needs to grab your flow library, right, when it already has that same flow library loaded, from an hour ago? Even if you update the flow library and you add a flow to it, and then you build it and you like send it to the, target folder, you don't change the deployment. You just have a newer version of your flow library that you've, published to your source. So, like, how do we tell Didact Engine, hey, I know you might have this flow library loaded already, but there's a better version or like a newer version. I need you to grab that still. How is it supposed to know that when it already loaded it, right? How does it know that? So that was sort of the idea I came up with, where I sort of thought, you know what? I think there needs to be like a push ID or a commit ID or something along those lines, kind of like Git does, honestly. And that way, if you had the flow library loaded from an hour ago with only one flow in it, okay, and then you send the newer version of your flow library to the same, deployment source. What if you did like a deployment push command or something like that, where it updates a GUID or some sort of like push ID or something? It probably honestly could just be like a GUID, just to keep things simple. Let's say that it updates a GUID in the database, right? So Didact Engine, even if it has an older version of your flow library that is already loaded, perhaps, it could look inside of the deployments table on its little, internal loop that it would be doing, and it would see, okay, well, here's that same flow library that I loaded an hour ago, and the status of this deployment says active or ready or whatever, so I can grab it if I need to. And oh, would you look at that? I have this flow library that I loaded an hour ago, but what I don't have is I do not have the same push ID for it. There's a newer version of this thing that's sitting, in the database references. I have an older version. I should grab the newer version and start running the flows out of that newer version now, since I've got the old version. With a push ID or a commit ID or something like that. I'm calling it a push ID since you're sort of like pushing the deployments up. But it's sort of the same idea as, like, say, the Git CLI. There's a new push ID. I have an older push ID, okay, that's loaded as, a plugin in the engine already. I need to get the new one so I can stay up to date with everything. That's kind of the idea behind it. So I'm thinking, like, in that case, Didact Engine would go like, yeah, okay, let's grab these files again and load them as a new plugin again, because now we've got the new, we've got a newer version of the library that we need to, we need to load. If that makes sense. And that way, using a push ID or something along those lines, we would avoid having to needlessly recache the same flow library like 100 times and just waste a bunch of memory for no reason. We don't want to do that if at all possible. Since we're dealing with flow libraries and stuff like that, we do not want to do that if at all possible. We don't want to do that. So, I think, that a push ID, makes sense in order to get Didact Engine to intelligently grab newer versions of the flow library without wastefully re-grabbing the same version of the flow library. I think that's like an intelligent caching mechanism where we only do the minimum of what's necessary and we don't waste any memory needlessly. I think that makes the most sense for how I want to do this. You see what I mean? How horrible, how just like utterly terrible this has been to build? Like, you see how horrible this is? It's just such an ugly nightmare trying to like design all this. It's a real headache. I mean, it's a serious head scratcher just sort of having to sort of wrap your head around all this gunk, if you will. I think that makes sense. I think I'm sort of digging, the idea behind that. I'm just sort of thinking, like, I think I just answered my own question. The only issue I was going to say was if you update a flow library and you change something about your flow, you need to be able to know, which version of your flow to run. But we have a flow version field already, and flow runs are intrinsically tied to flow versions, because a flow run entity has an ID reference or an FK reference to the flow version entity. So it would be your responsibility to update a flow version on an individual flow if something changed, in order that a new version can get synchronized to the Didact database when a deployment is synchronized. And that way you could semantically tell Didact Engine when a flow is updated or when something, has updated and Didact Engine needs to do something about that. You know what? I actually think I answered my own question. I think I've got that covered already with the flow version field. And I'll just sort of put that responsibility in your hands to update versioning and all that. And that way the queuing system and the flow run system would know exactly what it needs to do to get everything working the way that it does. Yeah, you know what? I think that makes sense. Oh, I love saying that. I think that makes sense. Guys, I think that makes sense. All right. No, I think I'm tracking with my thoughts here. I think this does make a lot of sense. The only other question would be the push IDs for the flow libraries. Do I want to track those for some reason, or is that not really something we need to worry about? Every single, every single push, I guess, that you send up to the Didact database when a deployment gets updated, is it necessary that we keep a version history of all the push IDs you previously had? Or do we just need to track like the most recent one, like the most current push ID? I'm kind of the opinion, I don't think we need to have previous push IDs, especially if, like, say they're GUIDs, let's say. I think not. I think not. I think we're good, right? Is there any reason we would need to track, previous push IDs, or are we good? I'm going to say I think we're good based off of the mental model that I'm working with. I think you only need the most recent push ID. I don't think we need to have a full tracking history of all previous push IDs. Because Didact isn't going to be doing like an entire version controlling system. It's up to you to version control your libraries. Didact just needs to know what the most recent one is, so it can grab, the newest, most up-to-date one and throw that, into all the Didact Engine instances, if you will, by fetching the deployments from their sources. So I'm kind of the opinion, let's go with the minimal model and not put any unnecessary gunk in there we don't actually need. I think the most recent push ID is the only thing that needs to be captured on the deployment entity. I don't think we necessarily need, I don't necessarily think that we need a full push ID version history table or something like that. I just don't think that's necessary. Yeah, I don't think that's necessary. I think we're good. So I'm about to add an entity. We'll update a couple doc pages. The only other thing is I'm thinking through, Didact Engine. How does it know what flow runs to write, to be able to execute? Since you could have any number of flow libraries and any number of flow runs that have been queued, to the SQL queues. But Didact Engine only needs to run flow runs it can actually, run with respect to what's loaded. The tricky part is when you load different plugins into the, flow libraries, when you load the different flow libraries as plugins in Didact Engine, that affects what flow runs the engine is actually able to execute. You know, there's an availability such that it's possible a specific Didact engine may not be able to execute, you know, a given flow run, because perhaps the given flow run can't be executed in the engine because, like, it doesn't have the plugin that it needs for it. In other words, it's sort of like a smart fetching system. You know, you have flow runs associated with flow versions, which are associated with flows, which are associated with deployments, which are associated with environments. That's sort of the hierarchy of the data modeling. So when Didact Engine is fetching flow runs that it can execute, you know, inside of its engine instance, it needs to only grab flow runs that it actually has access to, if that makes sense. Now, ideally, each instance of Didact Engine will have access to all of the flow libraries, because what I've been talking about is basically making, you know, all libraries available to all engines. However, think about this for a minute. It could be possible that early adopters or future customers will ask me for deployment policies, something like that, where you can specify a deployment fetching policy for a specific instance of Didact Engine. And you could say, like, if you have 3 servers, or just 2 servers, let's say you have server A and server B, and your first 10 customers only need to run on server A, but your other, like, 10 customers need to run on server B, right? So if you're having all these different flow libraries for all of your different customers, it could be the case, for example, that you want the Didact Engine instance on server A only to execute deployments 1 through 10, and then the Didact Engine instance on server B, you want that one to execute deployments 11 through 20. I'm just giving like an example here. So you would never want Didact Engine on server A to grab any of B's flow runs, and you would not want Didact Engine on server B to grab any of A's flow runs, you know, from the 1 to 10 deployments or the 11 to 20 deployments. In other words, there could be a smart fetching policy where you partition execution by some sort of identifier. In that case, there needs to be a smart system built into Didact Engine such that whatever the policy is, unless it's just default policy like it will be, you know, on this first version, Didact Engine only ever grabs flow runs intelligently that can actually execute with respect to what plugins are loaded, which are associated with, like, what deployments, in other words. So Didact Engine grabs deployments from the database, it grabs the actual files, it loads them as runtime plugins through assembly load context. That's how a deployment basically gets made available in Didact Engine. And then when that happens, right, in that case, Didact Engine would then it would so it would basically have to have a mapping module, right? Some kind of mapping service. So when a deployment gets fetched from the database, it has all of the information that it needs to access the deployment. It would probably cache that information in some kind of DTO or projection or something like that it would keep in Didact Engine and associate with the plugin container that actually loads the flow library. So it would have all of the associated deployment information from the database. We would basically want to cache that as like a DTO or something. And then we would grab the deployment from the deployment source. We would cache those files using the shadow copying method we talked about in the previous live stream or previous 2 live streams. Okay, we would shadow copy those files. And then basically there would need to be a mapping so that we can do that intelligent smart fetching idea that I was mentioning a second ago. Like if you have, you know, deployment execution policies or something. So the mapping, there needs to be a mapping module or a mapping service in Didact Engine. So a smart fetching. How about that? There needs to be a smart fetching or a smart execution module or a service in Didact Engine, so it only ever grabs flow runs that it's actually allowed to execute. I think that makes a pretty good amount of sense. So what I'm thinking is every time Didact Engine loads a flow, or loads a flow library, as a new plugin, I think what it's going to have to do is cache the deployment metadata from the database, and I think it's going to have to cache the push ID that's associated with it, I think. Yeah, because if it checks the deployments table on a cron job to see what deployments might be missing, it's going to need to compare what push IDs it has available to what push IDs are in the database. So that is definitely a requirement for it to be able to do. Yeah, that is a requirement. That does make sense. It does need to do that. So yeah, that makes sense. That does actually make sense. Okay, that does make sense. Okay, all right, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, all right. So it'll cache the deployment metadata, and included in that deployment metadata will be the push ID. Okay. And then when what am I trying to say here? Okay. When a given flow run is fetched from the database, it's going to need to be filtered by, I think, 3 things. It'll need to be filtered by the flow type name, the flow version, and the deployment ID. Yeah, I think that makes sense. So in Didact Engine's smart execution service, it will look for flow runs in the database, and it will filter what flow runs that it's allowed to grab by the environment, the deployment ID, the flow type name, and the flow version. So when it fetches a flow run, it'll filter by environment. It will filter by what deployment is available. And then the flow type name and the flow version. I think that makes sense. You would have the flow version, you would have the flow, you would have, or the flow type name, I should say. You have the flow version, you'll have the flow type name, you'll have the deployment that they both come from, and the environment. And I think you would filter the SQL by those 4 things. And basically the mapping service in Didact Engine would track all that. So when it loads a given flow library, it's going to fetch the deployment metadata from the database, including the push ID. It will cache all that in the plugin, container that loads the flow library as a runtime plugin. All of that deployment metadata and push ID, that gets cached. And then all of the flow type names that belong from that flow library, that also gets cached. And then the flow versions that are associated with those flow library, with those individual flows, those also get cached. So you have the deployment and the push ID cached, you have the environment cached, you have the flow type names cached, and you have the flow versions cached. So when you fetch flow runs from the database, you're filtering by the environment, the flow version, the flow type name, and the deployment ID. So you're sort of cross-filtering across, like, say, 4 tables or something like that. Little bit ugly, bit complex, kind of makes my life suck having to write all the SQL for this. But is it solid? Does it make sense? And I think, does it comprehensively cover everything? I believe that it does. I think so, yeah. I think this is a comprehensive and yet simultaneously minimal model where it makes sense to help you enforce some guardrails without, like, treating you like a toddler, and allows you to maintain, like, your own maturity with the platform, so you can follow some basic rules and use it correctly. I do believe this makes a pretty good amount of sense, I think. So I actually feel pretty good about a lot of this. I think I feel good. I think I like this, and I think that makes a lot of sense. So I'm actually going to really need to hop off here in just a few minutes. So let's just do a few entities real quick. Okay, let's do a deployment status .cs, and pretty much going to be the same fields as the deployment type, I think. Pretty much the same fields. Let's put that in deployment status. Okay, sorry, just checking my phone. All right, so we'll do deployment type ID, change that to deployment status ID. So deployment status ID, name description, yeah, all that's pretty straightforward. All right, good deal. So we have a deployment status, and then we're probably going to want to deploy or attach that deployment status to the deployment object. So you would have this, and then you'd have the public. Let's add a few more fields here. Public. I guess would that be an int? Would deployment status be an int? I think it would be. So public int. Deployment status ID. I think that makes sense. And then we would have a public. We've already got the deployment type that's up there, so I think we're good there. But we do need the entry point. So public string. What would that be? Public string entry point. Entry point. That would be get set, and that's a string field that cannot be null, or is not going to be null. So we'll add that there. I think that makes a pretty good amount of sense. So a deployment type, a source type, an environment, a name, a description, a status. Yeah, let's actually move the status up just a little bit here. 1 second. Come on. Stupid computer's lagging. Okay. So deployment type, source type, environment. Actually, I guess technically that should probably go below that. Oh my gosh, this computer is lagging so badly. That is just infuriating. Come on. Okay. All right. Okay, deployment type, source type, status, environment, name description. We'll have the entry point. That will be a non-null string. I think that all makes sense. That feels pretty good. And then we'll have the new deployment status entity, and that's just basically an FK table, you know, supporting table, name description, all that. That's all pretty straightforward. So we'll created deployment status, deployment field that I was talking about earlier. Yes. Let's make sure not to forget that. Oh my gosh, this computer is so slow. Good gracious. This thing is ridiculous. I need to do a restart or something. Okay. Entry point. Yeah, I guess we'll just do a push ID after that. So public. You know, a push ID just needs to be something simple. I don't see why a GUID doesn't work just fine. Keep everything pretty simple and straightforward. I think something as simple as a little GUID field. I don't see what's wrong with that. That makes a pretty good amount of sense to me. And then we added the status, entry point, and push ID. So added status, entry point, and push ID fields to deployment entity. We will push that stage and commit and push. Okay. All right, so I think that makes pretty good sense. And then going back here. I guess it could just be, I don't know. What's like I guess we could do here's what we could do. We could do deployment status set command. And that will allow you to set the status. Instead of having two commands, we can just do one. So deployment status set. Okay. And then if you want to see the deployment status on something, you could do text deployment status inspect. I think that makes pretty good sense. API Didact CLI deployment status inspect. Okay. No, I actually kind of dig that. I think that makes sense. Yeah, I actually kind of like that. I actually do kind of like that. So, yeah. No, I like that. That's pretty good. We're going to get rid of those old library commands because I don't think we need them anymore. So, no, I kind of like that. So we'll have a deployment init that creates the file, and then a deployment create makes a deployment, and then you'll do well, I don't know. I was talking about like a push and a stage. I could just do a deployment status set. So do I want like a push command or a stage and a push command, you know, like the get CLI does? You know, have specific CLI commands for each action. Is a status really all that's required? Yeah, I guess that's kind of my question here. I don't know. Maybe a deployment. You could say, like, when you stage a deployment, maybe you make it inactive or unavailable to Didact Engine. You know, you flip a flag or something on the deployment entity. You're not changing the push ID. You're basically just making it unavailable. If you're staging a deployment, you're basically making it unavoidable or unavailable, excuse me. Which is kind of the same thing as like deactivating it, to be completely honest. And then you can reactivate it, but it goes back to that, you know, that issue we were talking about earlier. If Didact Engine already has that flow library loaded as a runtime plugin, it needs like a push ID or something so it can differentiate that there's a newer version in the database and it needs to grab the newer version. And so, like, basically the push command kind of does make sense, because basically what you're doing is you are changing the status of Didact Engine to make it available now. That's the first thing that you're doing. But if Didact Engine has already loaded those flow libraries previously, then you are also updating the push ID. So the push command is sort of like a 2-in-1. What you're really doing is you're flipping the status to active and you're updating the push ID. You're doing both of those things at the same time. That's really what the push command does. So maybe I'm not as big a fan of this after all, to be completely honest. Maybe it actually does make sense to do text and do deployment stage, kind of like Git, just like what we were talking about. API, Didact CLI, deployment stage, and then we'll just do a deployment push. I actually think that kind of does make sense, to be honest with you. In which case, let's go to the folder and let's do, we've already got a deployment push page, it looks like. Let's do a deployment stage.md page. And we're going to open push and we're going to open up stage. Are they both empty? Or do I have something on push already? Okay, looks like I've already got something on push. Okay, all right, awesome. So we're gonna do push. We'll do ID, and that'll be deployment ID or name. You know, maybe it'll be ID or name, one of those two. All right, and so that'll be ID. That'll be you know, I don't know, what should I say, number. The target deployment ID. Deployment ID. Okay. Yep, that makes sense. So we'll do Didact deployment push, and then we're not gonna have that one anymore because it's just gonna be a, you know, one command, you know, simple, easy peasy thing. All right. Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. Or, well, yeah, no. We would do ID and, you know, I don't know, be 2 or something. Just throw an example there. All right, then we'll do deployment stage, and we'll kind of do that. So we'll say stage, and we'll say flags a deployment as unavailable in the Didact database in preparation for a deployment push. Yeah, something like that. All right, and then yeah, I think that's pretty straightforward. We'll do just like Git. We'll just do a stage, and you know, yeah, we'll do that, and we'll stay stage the deployment. Oh, right, yeah, and it was, well, you know what? Here's the thing. This is what's kind of cool, actually. If you want to push a deployment or stage a deployment, I think what's kind of cool is you don't actually need the file to be able to do that. You could actually do that just by looking at the config, you know, value or whatever. I actually think that's kind of cool, to be honest with you. So we'll just say stage a deployment and push a deployment, and the only thing you need is the ID number, or maybe we'll do the name or something like that. So yeah, I think that actually makes a pretty good amount of sense, and we've updated the doc site, updated the things here, the nav menu. So let's take a look. We don't have the create one yet, but here is the stage, and here is the push. So flags of deployment is unavailable in the Didact database. Preparation for deployment push. Yep, that makes sense. And then we stage a deployment. Yep. All that makes sense. Okay, Didact deployment stage. Yep. And then stage. Yep. Push the deployment update to the database. Yep. Yep. Makes sense. And yeah, we'll just delete that. I think that does make sense. Yeah. Deployment stage and push CLI commands whip. And for this one, what did we change? We deleted those old library commands. Don't need those. Let's get rid of these two. Status inspect and status set. I don't know. Maybe we can get away without those for the moment. All right. Yep. Makes sense. Okay, I think I'm gonna cut it off there. It is like ultra super duper late, and I need to get off and get some sleep. But I'm actually gonna try and hit this again tomorrow if possible, and if not, I'll get to it on Saturday. So you'll have another stream incoming, and I hope more of you join so we can chit chat with each other and yeah, continue talking about Didact. This is good stuff. Making great progress. So I'm real excited. So yeah, I think that'll be it for this stream. Thank you guys for joining. Make sure make sure all that's good. Make sure got everything. Yeah. Okay, good deal. yeah, so appreciate you guys joining. Thanks for joining the stream. Make sure to check out the Didact documentation site and the main Didact site. I have a few social profiles for you to check out. I've got a dedicated subreddit for Didact, a Twitter page or an X profile, a Blue Sky page, and a LinkedIn page. And I regularly stream on YouTube, and would love for you to join so I can talk to you as I'm building version 1. Working really hard to get that out as soon as possible. I'm feeling like the new target date is going to be December. The good news is I finally have this deployment stuff figured out, which is what I've been spending the last couple streams talking about. And I feel a lot better about getting the initial version out now. So I'm going to think this over, maybe over the next day or two, and I may make an official announcement to send out a newsletter. So just stay up to date on that. Make sure to check out the website. Follow me on socials if you want. I've got my own X profile if you want to follow me. And add me on LinkedIn, whatever you want to do. Thanks for joining in on the stream. It's always fun to talk to you guys about all this stuff. Appreciate it. Look forward to the next one. V1 approaches. Let's keep doing it. All right. Take it easy. See ya.